Hey, good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the second panel discussion in our series, Conversations on AI and Our Data-Driven Society. Today's subject is, whose work is this anyway? Authorship in the Age of AI. I'm Janet Bloom, and I'm happy to be back in engineering, where I haven't been for a little while, but I'm serving as Deputy Provost, and I'm very honored to welcome you and welcome this awesome panel to this event. As we heard, and if you were able to attend the first panel discussion earlier this month, AI technology has been around for a long time, and the clear takeaway was that it's not magic and it will inevitably impact future work. And that work extends far beyond the sciences and into the arts and writing, humanities, all branches of humanity, basically. And today's topic is, of course, a very important and complex one. What is authorship in the age of generative AI? As the use of AI becomes more widespread, we wonder how this new technology will affect the way we write and create art. Will AI replace writers, or will it simply provide them with new tools to enhance their work? What does the use of AI mean for creativity, for visual artists, performance artists, and musicians? Some artists may embrace and experiment with tech as a new cutting-edge tool, and some may oppose it. And as we experience the art, AI will, of course, affect that as well. Central question of authorship may boil down to whether we ascribe agency to artificial intelligence and what we mean by concepts of creativity, originality, and the human experience. So this is getting pretty deep here. These are not new issues, but ones that are questions that are on all of our minds. So today you'll learn from our amazing panelists as the discussion progresses about AI in the creative world. So it's my pleasure to introduce the panelists, beginning with our moderator, Sohini Ramanachandran, Director of the Data Science Institute, and Herman Bumpus Professor of Biology and Data Science and Professor of Computer Science. Sohini is a population geneticist who studies the causes and consequences of human genetic variation, which makes us human, right? And makes us humanities people and scientists and creative people. And I think it's fair to say, not to put words in Sohini's mouth, but the ability to support interdisciplinary research and the kind of work that you'll hear about today is what excites her and maybe convinced her to direct the Data Science Institute. Our other panelists are Professor Sydney Skybetter, Associate Professor of Theater Arts and Performance Studies, and now Deputy Dean of the College for Curriculum and Co-Curriculum as well. Sydney may be the first choreographer to be tenured at Brown, is that correct?
I think that's true, yeah.
Awesome. And certainly the first choreographer who does robotics to be tenured at Brown, maybe even anywhere. Yep. We also have Jenna Morton-Aiken, lecturer in English and Senior Associate Director for Writing and English Language Support at the Sheridan Center for Teaching and Learning. She helped us launch and assess Science Right at launch and assess Science Right at URI, an NSF-funded program that helps graduate students in the sciences navigate the invisible conventions of academic and public scientific communications. Here she oversees Brown's Writing Center, offers workshops and consultations on writing best practices, and heads up the Writing Fellows program. Professor Lindsay Kaplan, Assistant Professor in the History of Art and Architecture, whose research topics include art and labor, the digital humanities, digital art history, the social concerns that motivated generative artists working in the 1960s and today. And finally, down at the end there is Professor Inango Lumumba Kasongo, the David S. Josephson Assistant Professor of Music. Inango's research interests include Black feminist sound studies, ludomusicology, and hip-hop praxis. Inango is also known as Samus, and Samus has written, produced, and recorded multiple albums, EPs, and beat tape, and other collaborations in a variety of modalities. So without further ado, I will hand it over to Sohini with one bit of further ado, which is how questions will be handled for this. We'll hold questions to the end, and there'll be a QR code on the screens that you can use to submit questions, and they'll be transmitted to our awesome panelists. So thank you all for being here, and thanks, Sohini, and everybody else that's here. We're really excited to hear from you.
Thank you, Jana.
Thank you so much, Janet, and to all of you who are here today. We're really excited about this conversation, and I am just thrilled to get to join these amazing colleagues on stage to continue our conversations on AI and society and to consider an incredibly fundamental question: what is art? That's what we're going to talk about today, and I think I'm one of the most excited people in the room, but I think we're all excited. This has been and always will be a motivating question for artists and really for all scholars and anyone engaged in creative activity. So I wanted to begin with some history because I think similar to the conversation we had earlier this month, while we are certainly in a new moment with respect to technology, artists and computers have collaborated and quarreled for a long time. So I wanted to start, Lindsay, by asking you, well, I'll say a little bit about you. So you've studied how artists have mechanized art making over time and engaged with computers since the 50s. And I'm curious if you could tell us more about this history and also whether you think the decentering of the human artist today with tools like DALL-E is different from what's occurred in the past.
Great, thank you. I'm so happy to be here. I look at artists that use automated mechanisms, and let's just be clear that what computers were in the 50s and 60s was very different than what they are now. They were enormous mainframes, and a lot of artists were using the idea of programming and generative structures before they even had access to the technologies. So in terms of the work, it looked anything like a kinetic sculpture that had no technological elements but just moved, and so kind of materialized this idea that you have a discrete structure that mutates and moves. So in a work like that, the artist makes a work, but then the work kind of takes over, and there's an element of spontaneity and chance. Other artists worked with early programming languages and used pen plotters and algorithms to create works that they didn't know the outcome of. So again, these are two different ways in which artists were engaging with computers, either as a medium or as a kind of mode of production, so that they could displace their authorial intent. They could think about collaborating with a mechanism that was going to kind of spawn out something out of their control. And one of the reasons they were interested in that was that in that moment in the 50s and 60s was because they were interested in foregrounding the collective and material conditions of production in opposition to an idea that an artist kind of comes out of nowhere and creates a singular kind of authentically individual expressive work, because then the work's meaning is the artist's, and they wanted to unsettle that kind of equation between the artist and the work. Because then you as a viewer are looking at the work and you're trying to kind of, like a detective, unpack what the artist's intention were. This mode of production, an automated, mechanized production, opens up the field of possibilities of meaning, but it also kind of collectivizes it. It includes the audience, but it also makes it very material, concrete, and discernible. A lot of the works at this time were very simple, abstract works. So there's two really interesting things about this. One, that they wanted to decenter the individual artist. They wanted to totally dismantle what art was at this time, which was seen as largely as an expressive endeavor. And the other is that it was the human that was the programmed, predictable thing that the machine got them out of. So they were like finding surprise in the mechanization. And so it was the machine that brought in randomness and kind of unpredictability, and it was their own sense of tradition and conventions and their own habitus that they wanted to get out of. And so that's really different than today, when one, the technologies are massively different, the scale of the amount of money is totally different, but also the stakes of decentering your authorship and effacing your own individual agency with the questions around labor and wages and livelihood are really different. And so that's something I've been thinking about a lot, but I'm trying really hard to think about those two together, because I think that those insights about the collective conditions of creativity are still really relevant, but they are being troubled in new ways today.
Thank you so much. And I guess maybe to that distinction of who's doing the decentering, I think, is so important. I know we're going to keep talking about that. And I would like to continue along the historical theme with Sydney. So I've learned a lot from you about how choreographers' work has been really exploited, but used by technology companies. And I think that might be a history that a lot of our audience doesn't know about, or maybe some of our audience doesn't know about. Could you tell us a little bit about these mergers and acquisitions and how the body has been sort of leveraged by tech?
All day.
Please.
Yeah. No, well, first, thank you so much, Sohini and Janet, and I'm just so delighted to be on stage with you excellent nerds and in the presence of your nerdery, so just delighted to be here. I'll say, indeed, I have come to understand dance history as a really important antecedent to contemporary labor concerns relative to embodied data and its extraction and redistribution. One of my favorite kind of case studies of this is the choreographer Bill T. Jones. So in the mid to late 90s, Jones, who is a black queer man, collaborated with Michael Gerard and a number of computer scientists in the Silicon Valley kind of moment. For a series of motion capture experiments. So Bill's black, queer, marked body was captured, in a sense. Michael said snared, which is an interesting choice of words, and use this data to generate, on one hand, a famous piece of choreographic art called ghost catching. This is an important, kind of monumental work in the dance historical canon. But as is so often the case with motion capture and embodied data, the data doesn't go away exactly. It doesn't dissipate or kind of just, like it never dissipates. It always finds other homes, other haunts. And so in this case, the software set that Gerard was working with to capture Bill's motion capture data eventually turned into a piece of software called Max 3ds. Max was eventually acquired by Autodesk. Autodesk continues to use software samples and motion capture data that originate from the 90s, including Bill's body. And this, for me, is a fascinating a bit of haunting. Bill's body continues to exist in extraordinarily mediated sense in a fashion that is distributed and utterly unmarked. This is data completely devoid of its original qualities. And yet, it's Bill's choreographic expertise, his physical labor, that enabled these software sets to exist, enables them to generate animation as they currently do. Think Lord of the Rings. But Bill will never receive credit for this. Bill will never be compensated for this. His body, his data continues to work even in his absence. This, again, from the mid-90s, I think says a lot about how extracted motion capture data or our labor gets divorced from ourselves and is reapplied in ways that are beyond our knowledge and comprehension.
Yeah, and building off of that, Inango, can you, thinking about work and work that gets credited or doesn't get credited, can you help contextualize this moment for us in the hip hop context? So hip hop is really considered for a long time, what is music and what isn't music, and what is a creative expression through music. And so I'm wondering what insights you see about today's moment from the intersection of hip hop and AI.
Yeah, there are. First of all, thank you so much to everyone for all these brilliant answers. My brain is so fried. So just appreciate having space to think through all of the sort of various threads that are emerging. But in the hip hop context, sort of in the past 3 or 4 years, there have been some really interesting developments. So some of you might be familiar with these sort of audio deepfakes of some of your favorite or not so favorite MCs. Jay-Z was notably kind of, his voice was circulating around, sort of orating verses from Shakespeare, and Ye, formerly Kanye West, his voice went through some sort of viral audio deepfake moments where he was heard reciting Bohemian Rhapsody. And these artists, Jay-Z in particular, was very sort of vocal about his displeasure and his desire to take legal action. And at that time, there wasn't sort of recourse for him to stop the sort of proliferation and movement of these deepfakes. And they were sort of understood as kitschy, silly, trivial sort of technological flexes, but not connected with a sort of broader history around co-optation of Black voices. In more recent years, those developments have certainly shed a deeper light on the broader history, I think, around co-optation of Black voices. So the more recent example that folks might be familiar with is a viral kind of performance of a song called Heart on My Sleeve by Drake, and I put Drake in air quotes because he was not the actual author of this song, but the writer for this, who goes by the handle Ghostwriter977, who's not yet disclosed their identity, performed and disseminated this song using sort of a vocal filter that allowed them to step into Drake's voice. So to anyone listening to the track, they would believe that to be Drake, so much so that Universal Music Group, which is Drake's label, issued a kind of copyright strike. And the legal claim to that was, disputable, but the only reason it ended up being taken down is because there was, I believe, like a DJ tag at the beginning of the song that they could say demonstrably that is not the ownership of Ghostwriter977. But Drake's voice itself was not the sort of thing to be claimed as ownable. And so for folks who are familiar with the histories of hip hop and Black musics more generally, the alarms are going off, right? Because we have seen historically, starting with the emergence of blackface minstrelsy in the 1820s, this performance space in which non-Black artists step into Black personhood and are able to, the entire foundation of the music industry, the entertainment industry in the US is built from these sort of blackface minstrelsy performances. And so there's a deep recognition and anxiety, I think, on the part of many practitioners about what this will mean for who gets to take on the voices of artists who work really hard to have the timbre of their voices mean something, right? Like there's a value that's created through just the timbre of Drake's voice, Biggie's voice, Nicki's voice. And so there's a lot of kind of discomfort and anxiety and frustration because we, in the hip hop space have seen this pattern play out. There's also an interesting tension because hip hop emerges from the sort of play with technology, right? Like breaking the sort of use of the turntable or playing with the tape deck to create pause tapes where we're starting and stopping loops to be able to expand a loop over time. More recently, auto-tune, right? And all of these technologies have been framed as non-musical or allowing people who don't have sort of a skill to participate. So there's this racialized context around how the technology is understood. So I think for me, some of the kind of challenges or things that we're thinking through in the hip hop space are how do we ethically kind of move forward knowing that there's this hip hop ethic around experimentation and play with technology that's allowed the form to proliferate and become the thing that it is. We're so adept at breaking tools and technologies in the most incredible ways and creating new ways of speaking, but also knowing that in the hands of corporations, the same corporations and companies that have traditionally disconnected Black folks from their art, it doesn't matter how much we sort of break the tools if we're not able to own any of the things that we make through those broken tools.
I think that resonates really beautifully with where Lindsay started us, with how there can be this joy and surprise in engaging with technology, and now this nervousness comes out with tools like ChatGPT or DALL-E or generated music, and I guess. How do we, Jenna, dance around this when we think about writing as individual writers, as educators? The most common question that I get as data science director from individuals in this audience and from alumni and parents is, what is it going to mean for us as an institution, for Brown, to teach writing critically in a world with ChatGPT? And you've been engaging with this for the last 12 months, I'm sure, pretty actively. How are you and how should we as instructors and as an institution be thinking about what critical writing is today?
Yes, and I have been talking and thinking about this a lot lately. And I have to say, in some ways, it's really exciting. So I come from the field of English. It's an offshoot, specifically the discipline of rhetoric and composition. And that's where we study how meaning is made with words and images. And then we also research what are best practices for teaching students to use the tools to achieve their own ends. And so we kind of look at both the theoretical, how we make meaning as a society through those words and images, and then also what do people need to move through the world, like what they need to do to write the college essay, but also to get the grant, to persuade the boss for the raise, to write the text message so your in-law isn't mad at you. There's this really wide application of writing skills. And so it's exciting because people are talking about writing, about what it is to write, what is the process, what does it mean to identify influences, to pay attention to them. And so the word I really come back to throughout all of this is intention. How are we engaging? What choices are we making? And are we aware of the choices that we're making? So as I said, I come from rhetoric and composition. So that composition part means that when I teach, and I'm teaching this semester, I'm really investing in the students' process. What is it for them to learn how to think intentionally about the communication situation they're in? So sometimes that means, what does the professor want? What have they included or not included but assumed you'll know in their assignment? But more than that, it means, what do you think about when you go into a communication situation? You have a goal already. How do you understand the expectations your reader has? And the reader may not be a technical reader. It might be when you're speaking to an audience of people. So I'm talking about writing in terms of all the ways we use words and images. When can you use a meme in a work situation? When can you not? Right? When is TikTok going to connect with your audience? And when is it going to alienate your audience? So those kinds of critical things are really what I want to focus on in the classroom. And so part of what I do is meet with faculty to help them create authentic writing assignments so students understand both they have a metacognitive level of the skills there, but they also have a sense of this as professionalization. The way we communicate reflects how our communities build and share information. So that part's really exciting. It also means people are looking at writing as something that's valuable. And so what I'm hoping is we can continue the conversation to move towards something where writing is about scaffolding growth, it's about support, it's about explaining the conventions at work, and it's less about gatekeeping. And that's the part that is interesting and complicated, but it's really exciting. The rhetoric part, which is more of how we as a culture and society make meaning, that's the part that I find trickier and more concerning. We've been talking already here about the labor of other people, the words, the voices of other people. And so there are a couple of things going on with things like ChatGPT that I continue to ponder. One of them is, again, as a writing professor, I'm invested in helping every student find their own voice and equip them with the tools they need through multiple pathways to success, depending on what success is for them. That means it needs to be individual, it needs to come from students. And research shows us that students tend to cheat when they're either not supported in the work or they're not invested in it because there's nowhere for them to engage. So we move to scaffolded assignments, assignments that really are supported, talked about, and we unpack those invisible conventions, then that's great. And it means the writing becomes something meaningful. When writing is still something that's kind of a gatekeeping activity or we just follow what came before, it means we can use something like ChatGPT and it means we're replicating everything that came before. It's a predictive algorithm. So it's only ever going to tell you what other people have written. That means that everything that you have to offer to the world is erased because all it's doing is taking what somebody else said about it. And that even is happening when we're looking at coding. I have a hyphenated last name. Some computer databases can't handle it. So because that's their marker for end of line. So if you copy over the code, you're actually still replicating inequities even though it's something as simple as code. And so we're talking here about different ways we can point to our influences, acknowledge the labor and the value, and this system doesn't do that. So I'm concerned for a lot of reasons. One, it replicates inequities. It doesn't give credit or labor. Students or anyone who's using it won't have an opportunity to understand the influences. Even something like writing a summary for you, it's only going to, again, predict what most people have said about it. It won't let you read against the text, engage with it critically. It won't let you break it in a way that is meaningful. And so while I understand the appeal of this technology, I want folks who use it, especially students, to understand the risks to their own, really, their learning, to their power, and to practice the skills here so that when they go out into the world and they may be asked to engage with technology, they know what they're doing, they understand the power of this, and they're really able to do it kind of productively and intentionally going forward.
Thank you so much. I really want to come back to the concept of process and scaffolding.
Yep.
Later on.
Yes.
And I want to go back for a minute to organizing, which Jenna also mentioned, just the labor and the value of our creative work and of creative people's work. But something we talk a lot about in the Data Science Institute is how AI without guardrails is just going to exacerbate differences between the haves and have-nots. I mean, we could also have a whole conversation about ChatGPT and what it does with the non-English language,
Yes.
for example, right, which we're not having. But since AI has also been a key focus point in labor disputes today, like the Writers Guild of America strike, where it was a touch point for that labor dispute. I'd love to hear from all of you, but Lindsay and Sydney maybe about where are resistance and friction sort of possible? So the Writers Guild strike was a really interesting moment, I think, with respect to this, but I'd love to hear, the historical side from you, Lindsay, or whoever wants to jump in.
Yeah, I think that we're seeing a lot of precedent, like we're seeing a lot of models, collective resistance, collective refusal,
Yep.
kind of the reclaiming of ownership. I think those are inspiring and should get bigger and scaled. I think that I have a different thought, if that's okay.
Please.
I'm not a labor historian. So I maybe other people can speak to that, but in terms of kind of historicizing kind of our ideas about creativity that enable and also disable us, on that point, which I think is maybe related to some of these claims on authorship, but I think there's something that's emerging in the conversation in a way I haven't thought before about this, but there's a fantasy of creativity as this thing that should be frictionless that I think can paralyze students. Or for me, it was that it's something that you do alone that paralyzed me. My creativity happens in conversation. It happens mostly when I'm teaching, a lot of the times when I'm talking at other people in conversations like this. And so there was a kind of idea that if I was really creative or I was being productive, it has to look like this, and that's not what I do. In a lot of, I think, ways as students think that if they're good at something, it should be easy. I think that ChatGPT eradicates that blank page and that terror and that struggle. And I think one of the ways in which historically artists turned to automation, like I said, to defamiliarize themselves was to get out of themselves, but also to create friction, to create a struggle so that what they express is a surprise to them that then they respond to and then they continue to express. And it's a feedback process that produces something novel that's theirs, but it's relational also, and it's a process that involves struggle. And one of the things that troubles me less, there's again the questions around labor, authorship, and money are really important. But in terms of what is creativity, I think one of the things that the longer history of these technologies show us is that it involves friction, it involves kinds of intentionality and relationality that aren't always the individual that we think of, and that I still find inspiring and really important and actually enabling, because then the struggle is creation. I think the problem with that is then, okay, so where's the line between what's mine and what's not? Because I'm inspired by something, or I read something and that allows me to write. Or even when we talk to students about citing, a lot of the questions around plagiarism is like, well, sometimes when you're writing about new stuff, you actually don't know what your own idea is anymore, where your idea starts and someone else's begins. So these technical questions, I think, really lead to really important questions about who you are as an individual, that I like blurring, but then it comes to, when someone else can take it, those are questions I don't know the answer to as an art historian. I just don't know the answer. I see labor organizers and I say, thank you. So,
Can I just jump in for a minute? I want to go on the record saying that I'm a writing professor. I love writing. I think writing is really hard. And I hate starting. I hate revising. And I have to talk my way into it or put on a specific music playlist. So I'm like, all right, this is what we're doing now. And so I want to articulate that the struggle is part of the process. And if it's hard, it probably means that it's worthwhile and you need to practice it. And so I just want to say that writing is awesome. It is also awful. And that's an important truth to put out there. And using something like ChatGPT means you don't get the connection. You don't fight through that, and it gets easier. It's like any other muscle.
No, it doesn't.
Lies.
Don't tell them that.
But what is life? That is what living. Hello.
Yeah, no, maybe I'll say building the resiliency to overcome the obstacle. That's important in itself.
Could I jump in also?
Please, yeah.
In regards to the sort of labor question, so I remember at the start of the pandemic, so in my background in terms of my artistry is I performed as kind of a DIY hip hop artist. So a lot of dive bars, a lot of punk shows, a lot of crust punks and other folks are my family. And so at the start of the pandemic, a number of us came together to really start thinking about the ways in which we had been living as touring artists and the abuses that we had suffered and the ways in which we were charting careers that were totally unsustainable, and the recognition that for so many of us, the work that we were doing felt disconnected from the labor taking place in other venues, even though they were also having awakenings about those kinds of abuses. So thinking about trying to create a cultural shift around the work that's done by musicians and connecting it with gig workers, for example, and recognizing that the precarity that we were experiencing was very much in line with the precarity that other folks were experiencing in their other sort of workspaces. And I think that's important because what can be lost in the question of how do we organize around this is the recognition that all of these systems are interconnected. So if we don't have enough to eat, if being an artist means that you will have to make decisions about whether your rent is going to get paid, or you'll have medicine, or you'll have food, or clothing, or shelter, then of course these technologies are going to create existential kind of threats, right? Because it's like, if my job goes and there's no social safety net in this country for being an artist, then my livelihood is out the window. But there's a completely different relationship to these tools that we can develop when the very way that we eat and make a living is not thrown into utter chaos and disrepair every time a new technology emerges because there's no sort of infrastructure there. So saying that to say that organizing in all spaces, I think ultimately is effective for helping this sort of broader conversation around what's happening with these technologies. It's not disconnected. So any space in which organizing around food injustice or the prison industrial complex, they're all interconnected. And I think it's important to articulate that because it feels hard to go up against Microsoft or Google or OpenAI or any of these companies. They feel really, really big, but there's ways to organize in other ways that I think can still be effective at providing security for working artists.
I promised myself I wasn't going to cry in front of an audience today, but no, I'm going to see your precarity and I'm going to raise you to parasitism. So I'm an artist, I'm a child of journalists, right? So it's hard for me not to take this, these conversations on labor and coalition and destabilizing of microeconomic creative phenomena personally, I guess in the zeitgeist for the last, I don't know, 5-10 years or something, there's been this drive towards like hiring humanists at the Google, right? Or hiring artists at the Google, right? So like creative labs have sprung up at corporations all over the place. And these can be uncritically viewed as a kind of good. A way of corporate engagement with creative mode, a way of hiring artists. And to be clear, I am never gonna tell an artist not to cash a check.
Yeah.
I'm never gonna tell a writer or a journalist not to cash a check. But there's a complicated matrix of ethical concern that evolves or that emerges as a function of that engagement, of that implication. And so I think a lot about this implication. Because on one hand, the Google Creative Labs and institutional sites such as Brown do create phenomenal working environments for artists that afford them all manner of funding and technology and healthcare. These are really valuable things that are scarce. The precarity has effects. On the other hand, how we as artists or writers or researchers or critics engage with those resources, it's really complicated. I feel really deeply ambivalently about how to do that. I feel deeply unsettled by that. And so one of the ways, one of the kind of North Star texts that I've found to be tremendously useful in this context is actually the work of an incredible alumni of this institution, Dr. Anna Watkins Fisher from MCM. She wrote a magisterial book called The Play in the System, The Art of Parasitical Resistance. Hello. She writes as, functionally, we can't step outside capitalism. We can't step outside our individual implication in military-industrial phenomena. All we can do, and especially anything, the most that an artist can do, is make choices about the nature and degree of their implication in those systems. What can you do if you're always already implicated? Now, I find that really fascinating and inspiring because it suggests that the work to be done is not to remove oneself from this mess. It's not to absent oneself from the complexity, but rather to find agency within, despite, against, and through.
Can I jump in?
Yes, please.
I also your point and Ananga's brilliant point, I also want to point to the historical precedent here. A lot of the early artists found in computers and this way of thinking about systems that did bring them to think about what are the conditions of possibility for creativity and freedom. It's like having a collective housing. It's having kind of a food program. It was a lot of, and these aren't the way we normally think about early computer art, but it was it's the way I think about it, and it's what a lot of the artists saw was a kind of system thinking and organizational thinking that took life in all its broadest terms of survival, but also thriving seriously. And so it was a way also of thinking about the precarity. Again, it's been so instrumentalized and exploited, but precarity is a beautiful contingency of oneself on other people in society. And it's, again, the struggle today to think through that and the ways in which it's become, private, like the problems as it manifests today. I have sometimes a hard time bringing those two together, but you're helping me do that, because there is a sense that, the contingency of our lives on the systems around us, it does actually strive. Artists can become much more ambitious in thinking that what is creative, that actually takes me to these questions about livelihood, existence, community, alternative structures, labor, as well as just kind of, modes of support.
Yeah, I'll try to crystallize these amazing nuggets and take it into a kind of banal moment before we transition to Q&A, which is that just thinking about having us all as scholars, as students, as faculty, as staff, feel more agency in this moment instead of being afraid or swept away, right, by generative AI. I think there's so much that we collectively, we as an institution at Brown, can do to try to push back, to try to avoid vendor lock-in, by just going whole hog and using ChatGPT to try to compare across models, but really also to try to think about ways that we want to create sandboxes to play with these tools in a way that feels trustworthy and secure to us. And I think that conversations across the disciplines, and especially involving the humanities, are going to be crucial to creating that kind of trust. And that's something that the Institute is very invested in. I know Brown is as well. So it'd be great to think about ways that we can engage and feel like agents instead of feeling afraid. But now I'd love to turn, we have time for questions from the audience, and there are QR codes available to submit questions through, and they're going to be moderated by Janet.
Thanks, and just a reminder, as Sohini said, if you have questions, please submit them through the QR code. We have a couple already, and one question is, as the rise of AI continues, are there opportunities to protect what we create? Art of engineering innovations, for example, to ensure that it cannot be used to train for future models. What might the regulatory process look like? So some sort of a trademark, perhaps, against the use for future generation using AI. Anyone?
Well, I mean, if that's not an argument for live performance, I don't know what is. I can't think of any mediated. Thank you, Lindsay, for your charitable laughter. No, in mediated terms, I can't think of a way to protect against possible redistribution or co-optation. I have struggled to identify such a means, and I have not found one. But I think there's something, and I don't want to be the guy who fetishizes liveness here, but I do think there's something about live performance that does useful work here, or demonstrates the limitations of mediation as a way of pushing back against some of these more corporatized forms. I'm kind of looking at you here.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, so I think a lot about this because in my creative practice, I think about my albums and recordings as a script, and the performance is like the real thing. It's like the thing that I'm invested in creating all of this in service of. And I think what's been interesting in observing other artists is that in response, not necessarily to generative AI, but I think in response to feeling very constricted in terms of the lanes in which music can be distributed. There's Spotify, there's Apple Music, but if you think about where you last listened to music, what app or where you engaged with it, it's a sort of very limited lane of spaces. So I think artists are actually leaning into this process idea, like what if the process is the art? What if what I release into the world are the fragments or the verses or the versions of this thing that can never really crystallize or cohere as a full sort of articulation? And so here at Brown, at the Brown Arts Institute, William, oh my gosh, why am I forgetting his name? Oh no, it's gonna come to me at 4 in the morning.
Call us at 4.
I see Avery back there. The project Eternal September. Yes, Bill Bertel, William Bertel is an artist who's creating kind of his own internet through which you kind of have to navigate in order to listen to the music and engage with all of the kind of creative works that he's building around this project. I don't even know if I would call it an album. I don't know what to call it. It's a world that he's building, but it requires folks to meet him on his terms as an artist. I know the MC Yasin Bey, formerly Mos Def, has released an album that could only be experienced at an art gallery. You had to go to the space and kind of take in the works of the album in that moment. And I think there's a real return to the ephemeral, a desire to express things in ways that disappear and that the trace might always be there, but is there a way that we can kind of play with where the traces show up? So I think that's definitely a thing that artists, including myself, are thinking a lot about. Is the album, has that outlived its kind of utility? Is there a new way to share the things that we make and are creating than buying into or tapping into the streams that are already sort of existing? And that can feel really constrictive.
On a text level, right now, currently, there are kind of two ways to prevent it. One is don't put it into ChatGPT. We don't know what happens to text when it goes into the magical black box, but in theory, it becomes part of the data set. So one thing is don't put your contributions into it, and that way they stay with you. The other, and this is, again, just currently true, is put it behind a paywall. The great irony here is that all of our peer-reviewed materials are safe because they aren't able to get to that data. I don't know if that's better or worse, but that's something else. Is if it goes behind a paywall, the current technology is just kind of a web crawler that looks at what's available, and it doesn't go beyond that. So those are your kind of current tricks for not. But again, just don't put it into ChatGPT, and especially because we haven't, as a society or legally, decided yet if anything produced by ChatGPT can still be your intellectual property. So there are a number of risks if you're using the system, but those are my thoughts.
Thank you.
Oh, sorry, one last thing. The United Musicians and Allied Workers, which is a group of artists who are organizing, they have been working with Congressional Leader Rashida Tlaib to try to introduce some legislation around preventing companies from copywriting materials that use kind of excessively using generative AI kind of production. So I know that there are folks who are very actively organizing around that in the music context.
Thank you very much. Another question, what do you say to aspiring novelists and fiction writers as AI starts to burgeon and replace some jobs in the creative writing industry? And maybe that could expand to all of the artistic industries, but let's start with the question as posed.
I would, the kind of brutal answer is, I would say it depends on your goals. If you want to be in something that is producing content constantly and is kind of following a genre model and is popular and is kind of disposable, I guess it'll do that for you. It will replicate what came before. But if you want something that is going to change the world, if something that puts your voice out there, if you want to cultivate yourself as an artist and a contributor, then I would say you don't want to use it, I think, even at all. Because again, it's going to give you, even if you ask it to summarize things or compare things, it's going to tell you what other people said before. And the point of you as a writer is that you have your own voice. And so if we're in a gig economy and you need to turn out content, I'm not saying to use it, I'm just saying it will generate content. But if you want something that is going to be genuine and is going to really contribute and change, I would say don't use it. Anyone else?
Okay.
Anyone else?
Thank you. Here, another of the many interesting questions. When does power make an artist or author fair game? For example, Jay-Z is a businessman worth $2.5 billion. Does that make him fair game? Is parasitism not the same in cases like these? I guess it's sort of like the question is, when does the word aspirin or Kleenex not refer to the brand name anymore? But thoughts on that?
Yeah, I mean, I think that it's complicated. Like this, I've often heard the kind of framing of these sort of like generative AI systems in terms of sampling in hip hop, right? Like, oh, you know, there's this practice of taking and reworking and revising. And I think what's missed there is that with sampling, it's about a conversation, right? It's an intergenerational conversation. It's a way of using someone's work to sort of articulate your own sort of thoughts, but so being in conversation with that artist. So I guess with fair game, I'm not totally sure, like fair game for what? To have his voice just sort of used when he doesn't want his voice to be used for something? I don't really think anyone should, that's not sort of fair game, right? So even within the sampling context, people pull from work that's around them and try to have a conversation, and sometimes that gets shut down, right? Sometimes the artist whose work has been utilized says, I don't want my work to be utilized in this way, and in the history of hip hop, that means that that work is no longer able to sort of utilize that work. But in this sort of context where the authorship is really muddled and we have, it's distributed and there's not really a way to understand who the conversation is with, yep. I think it's definitely a sort of abuse of power, right, in that way, where I can't even speak to or sit down and talk with whoever is sort of taking my work, and not even my work, the timbre of my voice, right, the timbre of my voice, and what's the word, ventriloquizing me in that way, right? So even to Jay-Z with all of his money, I think that there is something wild about the concept that that should make it okay, especially, again, thinking about the racial context of how his work is understood and how Black artists' work is understood. Anyone sort of stepping into the space to take a voice and force it to say things, and therefore the person to sort of speak in that way is, I would not argue, not sort of fair game to be used in that way.
Thank you. What ethical considerations should authors keep in mind when using AI in their work? And can AI be considered a co-author? What implications does this have for copyright and intellectual property?
Sorry, there's a lot in the question. Can you just repeat the question, please?
I'm sorry.
Thank you.
What ethical considerations should authors keep in mind when using AI in their work? And can AI be considered a co-author? Let's stop at that piece.
Yeah. Ethics. I mean, how long do we have? We get into issues of consent here. To my knowledge, nobody consented to be part of this data set. And so we are taking their words, their voice, their work from them whenever we're using it. So that's part of the ethical implication, to know that people didn't opt into this system. It was taken from them, and there are now legal cases about getting out of the system. So there's that aspect to it. The other is that language is power. The words we use and choose to use replicate the way we make meaning, who we include and exclude. And so when we use something like this, it is repeating the power dynamics that are already in the way we treat each other. And as we all know, sometimes we're not very nice to each other. And this is actually where we get back to the idea that the peer-reviewed stuff is behind paywalls, which means it got what else was out there. So it got what's on the deep web and the dark web. And we see those inequities and racism and sexism already showing up. So in terms of ethics, not only do people not give consent, but also people who are potentially using what it produces aren't aware of the choices they're making. They aren't able to point to the fact that, some random website influenced what they were saying. They can't engage critically. It's not like when they are in conversation, it's just kind of generated for them. And then to the question of copyright and intellectual property, we don't know yet. And it seems hard to say that something belongs to a person when they weren't the one who generated it. I mean, there is a complicated conversation. So if you have it generate ideas for you, but you write from there, is that your work? If you write the whole thing and then you have it proofread it for you, is that your work? In terms of naming it as a co-author, in this moment right now, I would say it's important to acknowledge when you used it because it's a tool you used. But as an author is someone who contributed meaning, someone who chose the words with you, someone who is intentional about what was happening. And so I would say it should be acknowledged, like you would say you use Zotero perhaps, or you use this coding mechanism. But I don't think I would elevate it to a co-author.
So maybe as moderator, I'll take the privilege of the last question back to the panel, which is, we've talked about what if the process is the art, Anango mentioned. We've talked about the power of scaffolding, of revision. And I guess I'd love to close by hearing about your own creative process and technology. And not that I want us to end on a necessarily tech-optimistic note, but I'm curious about what's a misconception about technology and the creative process that you might like to dispel for the audience, or how does technology play into your own creative process?
I mean, I can start. Yeah. So I wouldn't be an assistant professor in the music department if GarageBand didn't exist. I don't think so anyways. And that's just facts. I started making beats on Reason, a stolen version. My brother stole the version of Reason from the class that he was in, where he was learning how to make beats. And I started making beats on his laptop that summer, and then I graduated to GarageBand, and I remember burning my CDs and sharing them with folks. And so I definitely have, I think I talked earlier about hip hop and this sort of playful relationship with technology. I'm someone who has leaned into that quite a bit. And I continue to be excited about the ways that artists are creating new sounds, new spaces for artists like me to step into. I think, I was part of a conversation today. We had a guest visiting our class, or visiting my department, and they were talking about the versus battles and this amazing moment that was able to be shared, broadcast to so many folks during the kind of height of the pandemic, that was a space for folks to celebrate the wide catalog of artists, Black artists who have created over the past few years, and put them in conversation with each other. And the way that Instagram sort of facilitated those conversations happening and reawakenings around the music and the art. So I think it's important to offer the caveat around like techno-optimism, to always be critical, to be thoughtful about how we're using these tools and engaging them. But I think you're right to also say that having a fearful relationship with the tools is not sort of to our benefit. And again, that there's ways to organize so that we're still able to play with these tools, be mindful, and remember the systems that they're connected to, even as we're sort of leaning into things that we know are not, that are complicated, and we're complicit, and we make our way through those systems. And so I think, I've been really enjoying having this sort of space to play with new tools, but also being in a space where there's a critical discourse about what those tools mean. I think that's the nice balance for me.
I think I came to technology through a very weird means, and I don't use it a lot. But I would say that there's a way in which, as an art historian, as someone who is interested in form, technology becomes another form for thinking about everything from how agency is structured to society is structured. And so that's the way I write, and that's the way I think. If my creative process is my writing and my scholarship, it has a fixation on structure and form. I take notes like this on outlining. But I want to call that a technology because it's the way I studied the history of art and technology that I came to think the way I do. Through structure, through a sort of forms of organization in space, and how I organize an argument and a kind of narrative and a story, and also deal with contradictions and complexity, the critique of something and also its conditions of possibility. I learned by looking at artists that were working with systems and computers to actually then think about, again, the body, the subject, society. Those became transferable skills. I just use Microsoft Word. I don't even know how to use Zotero. But I do think in space on paper, and that is, and take inspiration from the way artists dealt creatively with form as, again, that struggle. And my own writing definitely mimics that practice.
Thank you.
I use lots of bits and pieces in a lot of different ways. I talked about music playlists, about how I get started. So I build a playlist in a platform, and then I can listen to it anywhere. So if I'm at work, or if I'm, somewhere where I can have access to my phone, and what it means is that I start that process then. I don't have to battle myself to do the writing that is hard. And so I use the music for that, and I love the fact that I don't have to carry a CD case with me anymore to age myself, or Walkman for that matter. But it makes that transportable. So that's an important tool for my writing process. One of the other things I love to do is put memes into my Canvas site, my online learning communities. They're incredible. So the memes themselves, kind of borrow from tech in different ways of making meaning. But then it also creates a sense of community and conversation. And so it means that students are able to speak back to me, to share their own memes or whatever else they want. And so we're making meaning in words and text. We're doing rhetoric. It just looks a little different than it has historically. I have this remarkable tablet that I can write on, but it syncs to my phone and my computer, so I can both do writing and have PDFs and have access to it. And finally, Zotero. I cannot speak highly enough about Zotero. It's a reference management database. It's free. It's magic. If you want to talk after, Zotero. And we can talk more about Zotero. It's okay.
So maybe apropos magic on a certain level, in thinking about myths to maybe dispel here, when it comes to dancing with robots, and so this is a thing that I do, I guess, professionally, is dance.
You're paid in part for that work, right?
That's
So
literally my job,
that is your job.
Sohini.
Yeah.
And so dancing with robots, but also making robots dance. This is something that has kind of blazed brightly in the zeitgeist for the last couple of years. But there's a number of competing mythologies around this work. Two that I'll point out. One, that this work is somehow new. It's not. And two, that this labor is somehow abstract or lives at the code level. It's profoundly embodied. And so if I was to leave us with anything, it would be that the work that results in consideration of AIs or dancing robots, there's a profoundly embodied, and I would argue even feminist history, dance history even, to this work. And I'm thinking here of Nora Zuniga Shaw, Katie Kwan, Margot Apostolos, Amy LaVeers. These are the roboticists and dance artists who came before, who made this work possible. And in the rush to proclaim the newness, in the vigor and the excitement of the moment, that history and those bodies, that expertise, that embodied knowledge, so swiftly gets thrown away. And I want to hold on to that and acknowledge that and cite it.
Thank you all so much. I want to say that one of the things this conversation leaves me excited about is this idea of struggle and the joy of struggle that we have with our research, with our work. And so it's really exciting to think about how that might be something that's very unique to us and quite different from what generative AI is doing. Please join me in thanking our wonderful panelists.